The writings of George Russell, also known as A.E., and William Sharp, Yellow Cloud. At the turn of the 20th century, the Shee, the elusive gods of the native mythology of Ireland, had become familiar to the writers of the Irish literary Renaissance through recent translations of the medieval literature. My purpose in this talk today is to compare two writers, an Anglo-Irishman and a Scot, in whose work the Gaelic divinities appeared as vividly evocative presences which fostered creativity. There's some words for you, just so that you recognise them. As you can see behind my head. On the one hand, we have Shee, which means literally people of the hollow hills, and besides Shee, these are words of the gods. On Tuatha de Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu, which is frequently misspelled in a whole variety of hideous ways by Anglo-Irish writers. The first of our two writers is George Russell. Born in Lurgan in County Armagh in 1867 and educated in Dublin, where he lived for most of the rest of his life, Russell became a major figure in the extraordinary Irish cultural and national risorgimento of the late 19th and early 20th century. A radical intellectual, he has been aptly described as a myriad-minded man, for he was a seer, a poet, a painter, a cooperator, a political thinker, a journalist, an editor, a public speaker, and to a degree, the conscience of the Irish nation. He continues in some ways to be an underrated figure, as his interventions in particular fields of the arts were often overshadowed by the achievements of his contemporaries. W.B. Yeats, with whom he enjoyed a deep but difficult lifelong friendship, was a far greater poet. Yeats's brother Jack, a greater painter, and J.M. Synge, a greater dramatist, although Russell was far from unaccomplished in any of these fields. It's his breadth that's particularly striking, and the genius he possessed for combining practical activities with a deep and unconventional spirituality. His commitment to mysticism, to the path of spiritual discipleship, was lifelong, and underlies his attempts to unite visionary devotion with social progressivism. Our second writer was born 12 years before Russell in 1855. The Paisley-born William Sharp was from the mid-1890s an important member of the so-called Geddes Circle, a self-consciously Celtic group of Scottish writers devoted to the literary ideals which W.B. Yeats had articulated in the Celtic twilight. Despite dying at the early age of 50, Sharp was voluminously productive in two styles, as a literary biographer and critic, and far more successfully as a writer of poems and prose poetry, exquisitely evoking the landscape and elusive spiritual world of the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and Islands. Curiously, as writers, both men habitually use pseudonyms, and these illuminate some of the similarities and contrasts between them sharply. Russell, who seems to have been one of those rare historical individuals about whom no one had a bad word to say, habitually wrote and was addressed by others as A.E. So I've given that, it should be on that. Everybody there? That's how it's spelt. In the mid-1880s, Russell had completed a painting which had come to preoccupy him, depicting the archetypal man newly born of the divine mind. Lying awake seeking a name for it, he recorded that he felt a presence from beyond his own mind whisper the name Aun to him. Several weeks later, he chanced upon a book in Dublin Library which told him that the Gnostics had designated the first beings to be separated from the deity with the term Eon. Russell took this as confirmation that his inward intuitions were more than merely subjective. He planned to adopt the name Eon as a nom de plume, but due to a chance printer's error, it became reduced to the initials A.E. Much about this story can be taken as symbolic of Russell's orientation towards life in the spiritual world. Though the semi-divine beings of medieval Irish literature appear constantly in his writing, they are but one thread in a philosophical perennialism drawn from many far-flung sources. Russell was deeply influenced for many years by theosophy, that complex spiritual hodgepodge of Western esotericism and Eastern religion. Theosophy purported to be a rediscovery or bringing to light of an ageless, hidden spiritual doctrine anterior to all the religions of the world, which held but partial fragments of transcendental truth. So my point is that there's nothing Celtic, Gaelic or Irish about A.E. as a sobriquet. Rather, as an allusion to a learned, intellectual and widely diffused Gnostic Hermetic cosmology, it transcends both time and national borders, bringing with it the sense of the cycle of Platonic world ages which was so important to Russell. Furthermore, A.E. has a self-effacing and cipher-like quality, and the fact that Russell adopted a printing error without demur underscores his famous humility and gentleness. Sharp's choice of pseudonym is perhaps even more suggestive, both about the man himself and about the cultural forces at work within his writings about the Gaelic divinities, the Gaelic divinities. Strikingly, he chose a female nom de plume, posing as Fiona MacLeod, a supposedly Hebridean visionary in touch with an uncontaminated well of Gaelic folk tradition. Unsurprisingly, this act of self-transgendering has attracted speculation by literary critics of psychological bent. But I'd like to draw attention to what Sharp's adopted name says about how the Celtic was envisaged in the late 19th century. As many critics have noted, the second half of that century saw the creation of a discourse of Celticism, given its special impetus in Britain thanks to the poet Matthew Arnold's On the Study of Celtic Literature, much loathed by Celticists. An essentialist view of the Celtic developed, according to which the Celt and the Anglo-Saxon could be multiply contrasted with each other. Where the stolid Saxon was ploddingly practical and down to earth, the Celt was imaginative, always on the edge of mystical vision. While the Saxon's tough-mindedness had allowed him to harness the modern forces of industrialisation, the Celt retained an instinctive and archaic closeness to nature. Finally, the Saxon was destined to rule and masculine, the Celt apt to be ruled and feminine. A great deal of work has been done on the ways that this series of oppositional categories both licensed and justified English colonial imperialism, and could be brought into or sharply subverted by Welsh, Irish and Scottish writers. Sharp's adoption of literary womanhood in this extraordinary act of self-bifurcation underscores how powerful this identification of the Celtic with the natural, the numinous and the feminine was. Whereas the name AE alluded in an oddly impersonal way to the transcendent and universal spiritual order, Fiona MacLeod is a name which purports to inscribe Sharp within a real geographical location and community, that of the Gaelic-speaking Western Isles of Scotland. What both have in common is a sense of deferral and displacement, which was integral to the discourse of the Celtic in the late 19th century, and I think this lies behind both men's acts of self-othering. The numinous is not to be found in the urban landscapes of AE's Dublin or Sharp's London and Glasgow, but elsewhere, on the rural margins of Ireland or Scotland, or in the deep and mythical past. In Sharp's case, this mystical otherwhere was a real place with real and genuinely hard-pressed communities, and there's perhaps something faintly disquieting in Sharp's attempt to appoint himself the literary mouthpiece for certain aspects of Hebridean Gaelic culture to which he was not, in fact, native. So, having introduced AE and MacLeod to you, we come now to how Irish myth and its gods were faring in the Celtic twilight. First, a word about the divinities themselves. The gods of Irish mythology differ in a number of striking and fundamental ways from those of the classical world. Most importantly, they are exclusively textual. Lacking surviving shrines, images or votive inscriptions, we know about them exclusively because they appear as literary characters in the mare's nest of literature and pseudo-historical writing created by medieval Irish scholars. A number of these tales have been rendered into English by the 1890s as part of the emerging scholarly discipline of Celtic studies, or Celtology as it was normally called then. But images of the native divinities which emerged were baffling and rebarbative to the educated Anglo-Irish mindset raised on classical literature. While certainly imagined in human form, the native gods, the Shee or Tuatha De Danann, turned out to form an intricate genealogical tangle in which names recurred in a bewildering and wholly contradictory fashion. There was no apparent creation myth, no Irish theogony telling us how the world was formed and how the gods came into being and took tutelary responsibility for its various aspects. Indeed, no Gaelic divinities seemed straightforwardly to personify natural forces such as the winds, the sea, or fire. Even more strangely, from the classical point of view, whilst it's true that some of the early material concerning the Tuatha De Danann presents them unsqueamishly as pagan divinities, more commonly the medieval texts which AE and Sharp were reading gave to the gods more ambiguous ontological designations. They were imagined as half-fallen angels, for example, or as a mysteriously sinless branch of the human race, neither of which are conceptions ever likely to have gladdened the hearts of cautious theologians. And unlike the classical pantheons or the Norse pantheon, the Irish gods were not imagined as residing in a lofty and faraway place, in Asgard or Mount Olympus. Instead, they were usually thought of as inhabiting Ireland itself, albeit in preternaturally beautiful, otherworldly dwellings beneath the hills and prehistoric mounds which dot the Irish landscape. And in addition to being hidden under the Irish landscape, they are also habitually located in the Irish past. According to the pseudo-history or legendary prehistory or perhaps proto-history created by early Irish scholars, the Tuatha De were merely the second to last of a whole sequence of primordial invaders who had wrested control over Ireland long ago. For writers like AE and Sharp, whose cultural nationalism and romantic sense of the eternal Gaelic spirit was the wellspring of much of their work, the fragmented, contradictory and euhemerist nature of the medieval material presented a problem. From such a confused and confusing muddle, how could they elucidate and bring forth what they regarded as the luminous spiritual wisdom of the Gaelic folk soul, bringing balm to a politically divided culture which had turned its back on nature and the spiritual world. A.E.'s response was to attempt, in some of his many publications, the recuperation of the gods. It's important to note that A.E.'s attitude was quite unlike that of W.B. Yeats, for whom the Irish divinities were manipulable symbols of forces hidden within the mind of man. For A.E., on the other hand, the Tuatha De Danann were living beings which partook of an inviolable order of spiritual reality, which he felt profoundly privileged to be able to perceive. In other words, in A.E.'s spiritual vision, the Irish gods were the local instantiations of universal cosmic powers or entities dear to his heart because of his Irishness, but which had appeared to other peoples and been known with equal validity in other places by other names. Sharp as Fiona MacLeod, on the other hand, wrote less in the way of this kind of comparative, learnedly theological speculation. His wonderfully evocative writings about the figures of Irish myth, moving strangely between the pseudo-pagan and the Christian, look at themselves more as a kind of dreamy transcript of visionary experience. Now, A.E. certainly wrote in this vein as well, but whereas he, i.e. A.E., presents his visions as personal to him, MacLeod's writings of this kind are designed to appear to the casual reader as rooted in a flourishing folk culture in which such visions are still accepted and widely experienced. So, for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to examine some of our two writers' pronouncements on the gods, and then draw together some conclusions and some comparisons at the end. One of the major problems in attempting to describe A.E.'s understanding of the Shee, or Tuatha De Danann, is that his views significantly modulated and shifted over his lifetime and are accordingly hard to pin down. This is in part because he was perennially responsive to an inner current of visionary experience, but perhaps more to the point, he was also an indefatigable essayist in a cultural scene characterised by a ferment of constant controversy in innumerable small magazines, journals and pamphlets. As a result, he left behind a vast number of short pieces written for very various audiences, none of which add up to any kind of polytheological summer. Instead, they form an extended series of speculative and visionary meditations tailored propagandistically in such a way as to capture the imaginations of the readers of the journal in question. Thus, pieces aimed at literary scholars made extended references to medieval Irish literature, whereas those which were to be read by theosophists discussed the Gaelic gods in terms of Hindu cosmic cycles or Tibetan adepts. However, one essay of A.E.'s is of particular value for gaining a sense of both how A.E. thought of the gods of the Gael and the ways in which he drew unpublished material emerging from the new Celtic scholarship of the late 19th century. Entitled The Legends of Ancient Era, it was published in the Irish Theosophist March-April edition of 1895. Quotation marks in that. I'll come on to that in 1 second. A.E.'s central message in this article is stated clearly at the outset: to read medieval Irish literature as the repository of ancient spiritual wisdom, anterior to Christianity, but essentially in an esoteric harmony with it. In these legends, he tells us, prodigal of enchantment where gods, heroes and bright supernatural beings mingle, or are at league, or are at war together, I have found not misty but clear traces of that old wisdom religion, once universal. It goes without saying that no Celtic scholar, either now or indeed in 1895, would find any such thing in the corpus of medieval Irish literature which we possess. As I've noted, Irish medieval literature, including the cycles of tales ostensibly describing pre-Christian divine beings to which A.E. is referring, were all shaped or composed by clerics in an island that had been Christian for between 1 and 5 centuries, depending on the date of the tale. Most of the material is at the latter end of this dating spectrum, composed in a monastery by churchmen litterateurs. Now, very importantly, these medieval churchmen may not have known very much at all about the religion of their pagan ancestors, although they clearly knew the names and some of the characteristics of them. So the reader of medieval Irish mythological literature is not in the position of the historian of Roman religion who reads Ovid's Fasti or Apuleius' Golden Ass, which are literary accounts of religious culture and belief written by individuals from within that culture. Irish mythology is paradoxically all post-Christian, and we are increasingly aware of the ways in which the medieval Christian authors of this material have shaped whatever pre-Christian matter had been handed down to them and freely invented whenever they felt the need. A.E., in the last decades of the 19th century, did not know this, and he was accordingly at liberty to find that key Blavatskian doctrine, the lost universal wisdom tradition, in medieval Irish texts. His whole article is, in effect, a theosophical reading of the literature of medieval Ireland, or rather of more or less well-translated versions of it, but like many another Protestant Anglo-Irish writer, A.E. was unable to read the Irish language and found it impossibly difficult to learn. Therefore, the literary routes along which the gods of the ancient Irish were coming to his eye were doubly mediated. Mediated first because A.E. was reading sometimes sentimentalised and bowdlerised translations of medieval texts, and mediated a second time because those texts themselves were not written by believers in the ancient gods, but by much later Christian churchmen with sophisticated literary agendas of their own. There are three noteworthy aspects to A.E.'s treatment of the legends of the gods in his article, all of which might well startle a Celtic scholar who's read them in the original. The first is that A.E.'s vision of the ancient Irish divinities is essentially theanthropic. He sees them as human beings who have, by a process of spiritual growth and attainment, effectively euhemerised themselves. He uses the term tuatha de danann, hideously misspelled, for the Irish gods. As I noted, this term is attested in the medieval literature for the quasi-divine beings, at least some of whom are ex-gods. As A.E. writes in this passage behind me, which I hope you can read, which is rich, I think, in Hermetic blevlever, the tuatha de dananns who settled in Area were called gods, differing in this respect from the gods of ancient Greece and India, in that they were men who had made themselves gods by magical or druidical power. Superhuman in power and beauty, they raised themselves above nature, they played with the elements, they moved with ease in the air. We read of one Angus Og, the master magician of all, sailing invisibly on the wings of the cool east wind. The palace of that Angus remains to this day at Newgrange, wrought over with symbols of the astral fire and the great serpentine power. So I've also got some pictures of A.E., because A.E. was an accomplished painter here, which show how he envisaged these divinities. I think you can see that. Here's another one, Fairy Cave. So it's very characteristic of his work to produce portraits of hazy titans in sort of kind of crowned with luminous plumes, which are kind of implicate in and under the Irish landscape. The plumes really represented spiritual power and enlightenment. This vision of the gods as ancient realised adepts is pure theosophy. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the evidence for Celtic religion in Ireland or anywhere else, presented to us by archaeology, for example. But interestingly, A.E. has in fact seized upon one of the most inventive aspects of the ways in which early Irish churchmen, endeavouring to write sagas set in the pre-Christian past of their country, dealt with the problem of including divine beings. As we've seen, in some texts from medieval Ireland, the gods can die. In others, they're accommodated to a Christian schema as half-fallen angels or as sinless human beings. All of these explanations bear the stamp of an awkward Christian manoeuvring with the ontology of divinities. They do not reflect the pre-Christian beliefs of the Irish one whit. A.E.'s reading of these ungainly medieval strategies as evidence for a race of ancient, spiritually perfect god-men is, on the surface, rather quaint, but it also has a pointedly political message which A.E. leaves unspelled out. If these ancient Irishmen could raise themselves up by their own spiritual efforts and become superhuman, then this attainment could theoretically recur, and his Irish readers may aspire to divine perfection, becoming, in effect, the Irish gods revivified, anew tuatha de danann. On one level, this is an elaborate metaphor for a cultural and political revolution, sustained by spiritual values. On another, it is intended quite literally. The second aspect of A.E.'s use of the legends is the way that he allegorises medieval texts, using a schema ultimately based on Hindu and Buddhist ideas, filtered through Blavatskian theosophy. This process of allegorisation is in effect a way of mortaring what A.E. and others felt to be a crumbling edifice, a body of mythology which, as we have seen, was felt to be confusing and contradictory. To use an architectural metaphor, as the lineaments of Irish mythology emerged from the vellum manuscripts where they had lain since the Middle Ages, they appeared to Yeats, A.E. and his contemporaries rather like a Gothic cathedral, a medieval jumble of juts and gargoyles, complexities and curlicues, lacking the clean lines of a classical temple. A.E.'s solution to this perplexing jumble was to look east, taking the great edifice of mythology and spirituality of the subcontinent, as he understood it, and finding systematic Gaelic equivalences. Though this was rooted in the theosophical fondness for regarding the Hindu and Buddhist East as the place wherein the primordial wisdom religion had been best preserved, it's important to stress that academic Celtology was also emphasising links between Ireland and the Orient. In the academy, this was mainly linguistic, as a consequence of research into the Indo-European family of languages, and scholarly consciousness that Old Irish was in some sense a classical language like Greek, Latin, or more pertinently, Sanskrit. From a comparative Indo-European philology grew the discipline of comparative mythology, and so we should be aware when we look at this apparently very far-fetched material that for most of A.E.'s lifetime, the notion of a special link between the literatures and mythologies of India and Ireland had considerable scholarly respectability. From this Eastern wisdom, AE takes the idea of cosmic cycles, of eons presided over by various divinities and varying from the golden and perfect to the iron and most wretched, and the last of which he believed at this time of his life that he was living. Skip over a bit now, because of time purposes. The kind of idiosyncratic mystical misreadings that are characteristic of AE's use of Irish mythological texts could have some kind of peculiar consequences. In a work published much later in 1918, A alludes to the unity of primeval vision broken up into literature, underscoring his tendency, and again it was far from unique to him, to regard the surviving medieval Irish texts as merely garbled shadows of something immeasurably great, more mysterious and lost, perhaps recoverable, however, to the inward eye of the visionary. At times, not only new readings of myth, but new gods could be created and set upon their lofty thrones. In a long piece in his book, The Candle of Vision, A describes the god Lear as a kind of formless and uncreated divine protoplasm in distinctly Hindu terms. So, in the beginning was boundless Lear, an infinite depth, an invisible divinity, neither dark nor light, in whom were all things past and to be. So Lear here is a kind of figure whom A returns to repeatedly in his writing, and he's being assimilated here to the Hindu god Varuna, and also to the concept of Sat, being, in Hindu thought. In medieval Irish literature, Lear appears theoretically as the father of the sea god Manannán. He doesn't appear as a character in the earliest literature, merely as a patronymic for the sea god. So I need the Irish phrase. Now, Lear, as I've argued elsewhere, is a mirage, a non-existent deity. And in fact, the misunderstanding arises from a common Old Irish idiom for describing a profession. One is the son, in Old Irish, of the principle or activity or locus that the profession involves. So I'll give you 3 examples. The son of reading is a student, a son of death is a brigand, and a son of the sea is a way of saying sailor. So Manannán mac Lear, which ostensibly means Manannán, son of Lear, is more likely in Old Irish, in fact, to mean Manannán, the sailor. So Lear is a non-god whom A's theosophical interests and lack of a truly scholarly knowledge of Old Irish literature have led him to create and characterise a kind of paradox, an entirely new ancient Irish god. So A's understanding of the gods of the Gael as titanic Übermenschen or druidical Mahatmas is an idiosyncratic, I almost want to say idiosyncratic, result of his theosophical beliefs, his own experience as a visionary, and certain trends in late 19th century academic Celtic studies. For A, the whole of medieval Irish literature was open to recuperation, as though its multiplicity of texts amounted to a kind of misunderstood Celtic Veda, a set of Gaelic Upanishads. The sophisticated, various, and historically determined textuality of Irish myth was repackaged as immemorial tradition. By imbuing an essentially medieval body of stories with the spirituality and immense time depth of Hindu thought, A felt that he could unlock the meaning of the literature with the double key of Eastern wisdom and Celtic vision. This brings me extremely quickly to Fiona MacLeod and the gods. Like that of A.E., MacLeod's work entails the creation of new myths and gods from the imagination, but framed in such a way as to factitiously evoke the Gaelic folklore, which had been assiduously collected during the late 19th century. And again, like A.E., MacLeod's writing offers a kind of psycho-spiritual interpretation of elements of literature in medieval Gaelic. Here is a little sample of some of MacLeod's writing. For you, the passage is drawn from the Silence of Amor and appears to describe a version of a kind of Gaelic Earth Mother in the pastely Neoplatonic tones characteristic of MacLeod's writing. It's kind of porphyry via rockery, really. I dreamed of Orchil, the dim goddess who is under the brown earth, in a vast cavern where she weaves at 2 looms. With one hand she weaves life upward through the grass, with the other she weaves death downward through the mould. And the sound of the weaving is eternity, and the name of it in the green world is time. And through all Orchil weaves the weft of eternal beauty that passeth not, though its soul is changed. This is my comfort, O beauty, that art of time, who am faint and hopeless in the strong sound of that other weaving, where Orchil, the dim goddess, sits dreaming at her loom under the brown earth. Orchil, the dim goddess, a kind of Gaelic weird, is a favourite deity of MacLeod's. In other stories, she interacts with Manannán, the god of the sea, the genuine luminary of the medieval Tuatha De Danann, and also with Hesus, a Gaulish deity weirdly displaced by MacLeod. However evocative though this passage is in its rather nebulous way, it's also folklore. Orchil, both the name and the goddess, are simply the products of MacLeod's imagination and appear nowhere in Irish or Scottish Gaelic literature or tradition. It appears to be the name of a trout loch near Dunblane. A second particularly good example of MacLeod's modus operandi vis-à-vis the Gaelic gods is to be seen in The Winged Destiny, Studies in the Spiritual History of the Gael, which was first published in 1910. This book contains some of the most beautiful modern writing about Bridget, a richly fusional figure who is both the mother saint of Ireland and, in all probability, an ex-pre-Christian goddess. In a section entitled The Gaelic Heart, MacLeod tells a myth of his or her, it's always difficult to know which pronoun to use, we're talking about Fiona MacLeod, a myth of his or her own devising about Bridget and Manannán, framed as already collected folklore of pagan antiquity still living on in the Hebrides. So, here's part of it for you. That Aelia Bridget, or Breed, was a goddess of poetry and music, one of the three great divinities of love, goddess of women, the keeper of promises and dreams, the watcher of the greater destinies, the guardian of the future. I think she was no other than a Celtic Demeter, that Demeter Despina, born of the embrace of Poseidon, who in turn is no other than Leah, the Oceanus of the Gael. It's Leah cropping up again in quite a different way. And instead of Demeter seeking and lamenting Persephone in the underworld, it is Demeter Breed seeking her brother, or it may be her son, Manan or Manannán, god of the sea, son of Oceanus, Leah, and finding him at last in Ireland. This is completely fabricated. This story would have totally puzzled any medieval Irish scholar. It occurs nowhere in the medieval Irish literature at all, and it's entirely the product of MacLeod's imagination. So what's important to understand about this is that it's kind of awkwardly framed in the text. The story is half told in a footnote and half in the main text. It's presented as told to the listener. So MacLeod's representation of his own kind of psychic intuition and vision is here meeting a kind of oral informant who is kind of mystically close to the spiritual world in that supposedly characteristically Gaelic way. It's quite helpful to compare Russell and Fiona MacLeod by considering what genres they are writing in. So whereas A.E. is producing his material about the gods of the Gael in terms of learned essays and kind of propaganda exercises, Fiona MacLeod is writing in a very different genre. The main model for MacLeod's writing is Carmina Gadelica, a tremendous collection of Scottish Gaelic folklore and folk poetry and folk prayer, really, gathered by Alexander Carmichael between 1855 and 1899. It was first published in 2 volumes in 1900. So in this wonderful and very rich and varied collection of materials, there are invocations and mixtures of apparently Christian and pre-Christian material, full of kind of evocation of simplicity and piety and a culture of intense spirituality and communal life. This became very, very popular. And what Fiona MacLeod's writings about the gods evoke in particular is the endnotes and the apparatus to Carmina Gadelica, rather than the poems themselves. The kind of voluminous scholarly endnotes at the end of Carmichael's kind of gatherings of material show a sign of a folklore collector actively looking for traces of pre-Christian religion and quoting things in Gaelic and glossing them in English in a kind of macaronic way, and writing in a very sober, stately, rhythmic but unrhymed kind of style, with kind of one eye out for deep antiquity and spiritual potency, spiritual profundity, really. And so my point here is, Fiona MacLeod's writing about the Gaelic or the Gaelic divinities is not that these are translations of Gaelic material, Gaelic folklore, but imitations of a currently very popular and evocative translation. It's imitation of a translation. So, I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I'll conclude. The relationship between the two was warm from MacLeod towards A.E., but A.E., after initially being impressed, became very dubious about William Sharp, Fiona MacLeod, because he was one of the few people to actually work out their identity. And part of this, I think, is to do with A.E.'s suspicion and a very kind of strong lack of impressedness about passing oneself off as a woman. It's one of the few areas in which Russell's kind of open-mindedness didn't extend. One question that I kind of want to conclude with, really, is to ask, are these deities, with their kind of vagueness and sense of pastiche, are they in any meaningful sense the same as the ancient gods of the Irish? A.E. and Sharp are doing something wholly new and yet old at the same time.
Jesus.
There's no sense that medieval Irish literateurs who composed the sagas believed in the gods. But A.E. and Sharp were also freely creating using tradition. Whilst ancient Druidic beliefs were receding further and further into the past, unreachable over a receding horizon, as this is what's happened in kind of 20th century scholarship. In the 1890s, the suggestion that some Druidic doctrine about pre-Christian gods and goddesses was recoverable was not too outlandish. So the final question that I'd like to ask is whether a true mythic stature is attained anywhere by Fiona MacLeod's writing in particular, and to open the question of what myth is in a literary sense. One way of saying it is, kind of arguing, is to say that myth maintains the power to move us when summarised in the first words which come to hand, that the bare story, as it were, has a kind of potency. And I do think that some of Fiona MacLeod's material, particularly the story about Breed and Manannán, does attain that kind of mythic stature. A.E.'s writing, on the other hand, is closer to allegory, which demands an explanation of its significance with a point-for-point correspondence. Whilst myth must be, in literary terms, both self-evident and strange, self-evident because anyone can see it, strange because its meaning is mysteriously impossible to encapsulate and empty. It's ancient, simple, and mysterious. So I'll leave you with that idea that A.E. is essentially writing a kind of allegory, and Fiona MacLeod is attempting to write a kind of myth. And in fact, conscious of time, I shall stop there.